Let me tell you something about Vthara Academy. It floats. Literally floats. Right above the upper atmospheric band of a gas giant called Dervos Prime, where the clouds are the color of old bruises, and the gravity is just uncomfortable enough to remind every student that the universe does not particularly care about their comfort. The Academy itself is a ring-shaped structure, wide enough to hold 12,000 students from 41 different species, and prestigious enough that parents across 6 star systems spend the better part of their children's early lives bragging about it at dinner parties. I, Corveth of the Selthari, had earned my place here through 3 consecutive years of academic excellence, 2 published papers on xenolinguistic drift patterns, and 1 extremely unfortunate incident involving a Druvathi lab partner and a miscalculated chemical compound that I will not be discussing today, or ever. The point is, I was not someone who impressed easily. I was sitting in Lecture Hall 14 on the first morning of the new semester, in my preferred seat, which was 3rd row, left side, close enough to the front to appear engaged, far enough from the professor to avoid being called on without warning. A solid academic strategy that I had refined over 4 years of higher education. Professor Dammis Cruel had not arrived yet. Yes, that was his real name, Dammis Cruel. The man had been born with that name, and somewhere along the way he had simply decided to grow into it. He was a Thurvani, which meant he stood at roughly 2.5 meters tall, had skin the color of polished charcoal, 4 arms that he used with alarming efficiency when pointing at projection screens, and a voice that could make a room full of graduate students feel like they had just been caught doing something wrong, even when they had not. He was, by every measurable standard, the greatest living xenoarchaeologist in the known galaxy. He was also, by every measurable standard, completely terrifying. The hall filled up quickly. Selthari students like myself, sleek and silver-scaled, taking careful notes before the lecture had even begun. A cluster of Bovary in the back, wide-eyed and tentative, their bioluminescent patches flickering the pale yellow of nervousness. A pair of Veranthis near the window, tall and angular, speaking to each other in clipped tones. The usual mix, the usual faces. And then, 2 minutes before the lecture was scheduled to begin, the door opened. He was human. Now, I want to be clear. I had seen humans before. Vthara Academy had a small but consistent human enrollment, maybe 60 or 70 students in total across all programs. They were not unusual. They were not remarkable. They were, as a species, aggressively average in nearly every physical category, which I had always found mildly impressive in its own underwhelming way. Medium height, medium build, a distressing lack of any interesting biological features, no natural armor, plating, no secondary nervous system, no echolocation, just a face and 2 arms and an attitude that seemed wildly disproportionate to their actual capabilities. This one was named Rael Corro. He was young-looking, though I would come to understand later that this was not particularly useful information when applied to humans. He had dark hair, kept short and slightly uneven, as though he had cut it himself, and then immediately stopped caring about the result. His uniform was technically correct, but worn in a way that suggested he had dressed in low light. He walked in, looked around the room once with eyes that were a quiet, unremarkable brown, and then sat down in the very back row, in the corner seat, and said absolutely nothing to anyone. Nobody paid him much attention. I made a small note in my journal. Transfer student, human, back corner, possible introvert or possible strategist. I did not yet know which one was more dangerous. Professor Dammis Cruel entered the hall at Exactly the scheduled time, which he always did, because he considered lateness a form of intellectual disrespect, and had been known to lock the doors at the first second of class with a cheerfulness that bordered on criminal. He set down nothing. He carried nothing. He simply walked to the front of the hall, looked at all of us with the calm expression of a predator who has already decided the outcome of the encounter, and said, "Veranthis." That was it. Just the one word. And then the projection behind him lit up. I had studied xenoarchaeology as a secondary discipline for 2 years. I thought I knew what the Veranthis ruins looked like from academic records. I was, it turned out, embarrassingly wrong about the scale of what I knew. The images that filled the projection wall were not the clean, catalogued photographs from the academic databases. These were raw survey images, unprocessed, taken by deep-field drones sent into the Haroveth sector nearly 80 years ago, and apparently never fully released to the public record until Damis had spent a decade fighting the Interstellar Preservation Council for access. The ruins were enormous. Not enormous in the way that impressive buildings are enormous. Enormous in the way that makes your brain quietly suggest that maybe you should sit down, because the scale of what you are looking at simply does not fit inside any framework you have previously built for understanding size and time and the ambitions of living things. Towers that had once reached above cloud level, foundations carved directly into the bedrock of a planet that had since gone cold. Streets wide enough to move armies through. And everywhere, the signature of the Veranthis builders, interlocking geometric patterns carved with a precision that no civilization since had been able to fully replicate. 11,240 years, Professor Dammis said, his voice filling the hall without any apparent effort. That is the conservative estimate for when the Veranthis civilization ceased to exist. Not declined, not migrated. Ceased. There is no living trace, no recorded survivor, no descendant culture. They built, they thrived, they reached a height of technological and social complexity that we still do not fully understand. And then they stopped, and nobody knows why. The hall was very quiet. I was, I will admit, completely absorbed. I had read about the Veranthis in textbooks. Reading about them in textbooks and seeing these images on a wall the size of a starship bay were two entirely different experiences. Damis continued for another several minutes, walking through the known archaeological timeline, the disputed theories about the civilization's collapse, the ongoing debates about whether the geometric patterns were decorative or functional. He was, as always, precise, authoritative, and faintly contemptuous of anyone who had gotten the details wrong in prior research, which he named by name with a kind of quiet enjoyment that I found both alarming and deeply entertaining. And then, from the back corner of the room, a voice said, "That central tower complex in the third image. The orientation is wrong in your projection. The main entrance faced the secondary sun, not the primary." The hall went very still. Professor Dammis Cruel stopped mid-sentence. He turned, slowly, and he looked at the human boy in the back corner, who was not looking at him with defiance or challenge, or any of the expressions you would expect from someone who had just interrupted the most respected xenoarchaeologist alive in the middle of his own lecture on his own subject. He was looking at the projection, quietly, like someone who had just noticed a picture frame hanging slightly crooked on a wall and had mentioned it almost to themselves. "I beg your pardon," Professor Dammis said, and those 4 words, in his particular voice, had historically been enough to make doctoral candidates reconsider their career choices. Rael Corro looked at him then. "The main entrance," he said again, patiently. "It faced the secondary sun, Veth Minor. The primary sun is too harsh at that latitude during the construction era. They adjusted the whole complex around the secondary light cycle. If you reorient the projection by about 12 degrees clockwise, the shadow patterns match the interior layout better. Nobody in the hall breathed. Professor Dammis did not immediately respond. This, in itself, was remarkable. The man had a response for everything. He had responses prepared for responses. He was the sort of academic who had, on at least 3 documented occasions, corrected visiting lecturers mid-sentence, and then invited them for tea afterward as though nothing had happened. He looked at Rael for a long moment. Then he said, very carefully, "What is your source for that claim?" And Rael said, "Personal observation." Now, at this point, the logical response from any reasonable person in that lecture hall would have been to laugh. Personal observation of ruins that were 11,000 years old. Personal observation. The ruins of a civilization that had been dead longer than most species currently alive had been developing written language. Personal observation. A few students did, actually, start to make sounds that were adjacent to laughter. They stopped when they saw Rael's face. Because he was not joking. He was not performing. He was not doing the thing that some students do, where they make an outrageous claim to seem interesting and then laugh it off when pressed. He was looking at Professor Dammis with an expression that I can only describe as carefully controlled discomfort, like someone who had said slightly more than they intended to say and was now calculating the cost of having said it. I watched him from my seat. I am, as I mentioned, observant by nature and profession. And what I saw in that back corner was not a student trying to be clever. It was a student who knew something he had not entirely planned to share, and who was now quietly deciding how much further to go. "The interior chamber off the northeast corridor," Rael said, after a pause. "The one your survey images do not have good coverage of."
The ceiling has a panel array, roughly 4 meters across, made of a material your instruments probably logged as decorative stone. It is not decorative.
"It is a pressure-sensitive mapping system. The Veranthis used it to track migration routes. There are marker indentations along the eastern edge, about 60 of them, each one corresponding to a settlement that existed within a 400-kilometer radius." The hall was so quiet, I could hear the atmospheric processors humming in the walls. Professor Dammis had not moved. "The survey team," he said slowly, "noted an anomalous panel in that location. It was catalogued as structurally interesting, but functionally undetermined. That report is in a restricted archive. It has never been published." "I know," Rael said. "Then how?" Damis said, and his voice had shifted now, the way a very large, very calm creature shifts when something unexpected has moved in its territory. "Do you know what it is?" Rael looked at him for a moment. "I was there," he said. "You have to understand what happened next, in the context of who Professor Dammis Cruel was as an academic and as a person." He did not panic. He did not dismiss Rael. He did not do any of the things that a less disciplined intellect might have done when confronted with a claim that was, on its surface, completely impossible. What he did was turn to his desk console, pull up a security clearance that I was fairly certain most people in that room did not know he had, and access a sealed archive file that the Interstellar Preservation Council had classified at the highest research level. Raw drone footage, unedited, from the interior chamber Rael had just described. He projected it, and the panel was exactly where Rael had said it was. Exactly the size Rael had said it was, and along the eastern edge, visible even through the low-resolution drone camera, were the marker indentations, small, precise. 60 of them, maybe more, spaced in a pattern that, once you knew what you were looking for, was obviously deliberate. Nobody in the hall made a sound. I was watching Rael. He was watching the footage with an expression I did not have a clean word for, inselthari. It was somewhere between recognition and sadness. The way you might look at an old image of a place you had loved and lost. Not dramatic, not performed, just quiet and private and slightly tired. Professor Dammis turned off the projection. He looked at Rael for a very long time. "You will stay after class," he said, and his voice was not the voice he used when he was angry. It was the voice he used when he had encountered something that genuinely surprised him, which, by all accounts, had not happened to him in approximately 30 years. The rest of the lecture continued. Technically, Damis spoke. Students took notes. The information was presented, but every few minutes, someone's eyes would drift to the back corner, and Rael would be sitting there, arms folded loosely, looking at nothing in particular, with the particular stillness of someone who had been sitting in rooms waiting for things to be over for a very, very long time. After class, I did not leave. I told myself it was academic curiosity. This was, if I am being honest with myself, only about 40% true. Damis questioned Rael for the better part of an hour. He pulled up image after image, record after record, cross-referencing details that he had spent a career cataloging, and Rael answered every single question. Not quickly, not with the speed of someone reciting memorized data. Slowly, carefully, the way someone answers when they are actually remembering, sorting through their own recollection of something rather than a database. He knew which materials the Veranthis had sourced from which regions. He knew which buildings had been built in which order and why. He knew that the large plaza in the survey images had been a market, specifically a morning market, because the acoustics of the surrounding structures were designed to carry sound in a specific direction during the early hours when the secondary sun was at a low angle, and the vendors needed to call out to customers who could not yet see their stalls from the main approach road. At one point, Damis put down his stylus, looked at Rael, and said very quietly, "Who are you?" And Rael said, "Rael Corro, transfer student. I was late to register, so I got put in your section. Sorry about that." I had to press my hand against my mouth to keep from making noise. By the following morning, word had moved through Vthara Academy, the way rumors always do in enclosed academic environments, which is to say, at approximately the speed of sound, and with roughly triple the dramatic embellishment of the original event. I heard 3 different versions before I had even reached the dining hall. In one version, a human student had challenged Damis to an academic duel. In another, Damis had personally escorted the student to the Preservation Council's secure archive. In the third, and my personal favorite, the student had somehow hacked the archive before class as an elaborate prank. The truth, of which I was one of maybe 8 direct witnesses, was both simpler and considerably more unsettling. Professor Olaxi Veth heard about it by mid-morning. Olaxi was the head of the Veranthis Cultural Studies Department, which sounds like a mild academic specialty, until you understand that the Veranthis had the longest continuous historical record of any species in the known galaxy, going back nearly 30,000 years, and that Olaxi had spent 60 years of her career cataloging civilizations that most species had never even heard of. She was precise, she was thorough, and she had exactly 0 patience for what she called romantic historical fantasy, by which she meant any claim about ancient history that was not supported by at minimum 3 independent verified sources. She found Rael at lunch. She sat down across from him without asking, put 3 separate data tablets on the table, and said, "I have some questions." From across the dining hall, I watched this happen, because I had, by this point, made the entirely reasonable decision to keep Rael Corro in my line of sight whenever possible. The 3 tablets contained references to 3 completely separate extinct civilizations. The Dovari Collective, gone for roughly 19,000 years. The Cenith Builders, gone for closer to 25,000. And a third group that I had never even heard of, which Olaxi referred to only as the Pale Architects, whose ruins existed on exactly one planet and whose history was considered so fragmentary as to be nearly unresearchable. Rael ate his lunch. He looked at the tablets. He answered her questions. I was too far away to hear the specifics. What I could see was Olaxi's face. She was a Veranthis, which meant her expressions were subtler than most species, controlled by a combination of facial musculature and the faint color shifts in the elongated ridge along her jawline. A pale yellow indicated mild interest. A deeper amber indicated surprise. A shift toward blue indicated significant emotional response of some kind. Her jaw ridge went blue during the third answer. She stared at Rael for a long moment. Then she picked up her tablets, stood up, and walked out of the dining hall without finishing her own meal. An elder professor named Damis Cruel, one of the oldest faculty members at Vthara, and a specialist in what was called the pre-sequence era, which referred to a period so ancient that most academic departments considered it theoretical rather than historical, happened to be walking past when Olaxi came out. They spoke, briefly, in the corridor outside. Damis went in. He sat down with Rael. He asked one question. I do not know what the question was. I do not know what Rael answered. What I know is that Damis Cruel, who had been teaching at Vthara Academy for longer than I had been alive, who had published 47 major works and 3 field-defining theoretical frameworks, stood up from that table, nodded once at Rael with an expression of profound and slightly shattered calm, and walked out of the dining hall and did not come back for the rest of the day. His afternoon lecture was cancelled, with no explanation given. I found Rael after his last class of the day on one of the exterior observation platforms on the Academy's lower ring. The platforms were quiet in the late afternoon. Most students went inward during the shift change, when the atmospheric processors cycled and the temperature dropped slightly. I liked them precisely because they were quiet, and because from them you could watch. The cloud bands of Dervos Prime shift and roll far below, slow and vast, and completely indifferent to anything happening on the station above. Rael was standing at the railing. He had a cup of something warm, and he was looking at the clouds. I walked up and stood next to him without introducing myself, which is, I acknowledge, a slightly aggressive social opening. But I had the sense that with Rael, trying to ease into a conversation would take longer than I had patience for. You made Professor Damis leave the room today, I said. Rael glanced at me. He asked a specific question. I gave a specific answer. I did not know it would affect him that much. What was the question? He looked back at the clouds. He asked if there was anything still standing from his research period. He has spent his career working from fragments and theoretical models. He wanted to know if any of it was right. A pause. Some of it was. I watched him. You were actually there, I said. Not a question. Yes. 11,000 years ago, with the Veranthis. Longer, actually. The Veranthis era overlaps with some other periods I was present for. 11,000 years is just the one Damis lectures on. I was quiet for a moment, processing this. Humans, I said slowly, are not supposed to be that old. Your species' recorded spacefaring history is barely 800 years. Rael smiled. It was a small smile, the kind that carries more history in it than the expression itself should be able to hold. Recorded is an interesting word, he said. Humans record things we want other humans to know about. There is a lot we did not particularly advertise. How? I asked. How is it possible? He turned the cup in his hands. You know how your species experiences time? As a linear sequence, yes. Right. And you experience it at a consistent rate, relative to your biology. A year feels like a year. A century is a very long time. 1,000 years is incomprehensible except as an abstract number. He looked at me. Humans do not always experience time that way. There are states, conditions, some voluntary, some not, where time outside moves and time inside does not, or barely does. It is not common. Most humans have never experienced it and never will, but it is also not as rare as the rest of the galaxy seems to assume. You are saying you were dormant, I said, for thousands of years. Sometimes, not always dormant, sometimes present but moving at a different rate. It is complicated to explain cleanly. He paused. Your people think 11,000 years is ancient history. For me, it is more like a very bad Tuesday. I stared at him. He took a sip of his drink. That is not funny, I said. No, he agreed, and his voice had something in it that confirmed clearly that he was not trying to be funny. It is not. We stood there for a moment, watching the clouds. Why are you here? I asked. At Vthara, in Damis's class. If you were there, if you know all of it, why sit through a lecture about it? He was quiet for long enough that I thought he might not answer. Because, he said finally, it matters that someone gets it right. It matters that the people who study these civilizations understand what they actually were, not just what they can piece together from ruins. The Veranthis were not a mystery. They were people. They had markets and morning routines, and they argued about things that did not matter. And they loved specific places and specific moments in ways that no survey image will ever capture. He looked at the clouds again. I cannot give anyone back what was lost, but I can at least make sure it is remembered correctly. He told me one story. I did not ask for it. I think perhaps he had been carrying it for a long time, and something about the particular quality of the late afternoon light over Dervos Prime and the silence of the observation deck made it possible to set down for a moment. There was a street, he said, in the central district of the main Veranthis settlement, the one in Damis's images. It was a narrow street, not a main road, the kind that existed in the space between two larger buildings where someone had eventually thought to pave the gap and put in a few low lights. He paused. It was the kind of street that was not on any official map because nobody had thought to put it there. But people used it as a shortcut, and someone had put a small bench against one wall, and there was a plant growing up through a crack in the paving that had no business thriving in that kind of light. But it did anyway. He stopped. I waited. There was a child on that bench, he said. Small. Maybe 5 or 6 by Veranthis developmental standards. She was sitting there by herself, watching people walk past, and she had a piece of folded material in her hands, the kind of thing children made in that culture. A toy, basically. A folded shape you could open and close. And she was opening, and closing it very slowly and steadily, not playing with it exactly, just holding on to the motion of it. He paused again. She looked up at me when I walked past. Just looked, then went back to her toy. The clouds below moved, slow, enormous, unconcerned. That is not a historical record, Rael said. That is not in any database. Nobody dug up evidence of that child or that bench or that plant. Nobody will write a paper about the specific way that light fell on that street at the time of day I walked through it. But it happened. It was real. She was real. His voice was steady, but there was a weight in it that had nothing to do with volume. And now I am the only one who remembers it. I did not say anything. There was nothing to say that would not have been either insufficient or in poor taste. After a while, I asked, "Is it lonely?" He considered this seriously, which I appreciated. He did not give me the easy answer. "Yes," he said, "but it is also a kind of responsibility. If I do not remember them, they are only ruins. If I remember them, they are still, in some small way, people." He finished his drink. "I would rather them be people." I thought about the child on the bench, about the plant growing through cracked stone, about a civilization so vast and complex that its ruins still dwarfed the ambitions of every species that had come after it, reduced in the academic record to survey images and disputed theories and heated arguments about the orientation of a doorway. And I thought about a human boy sitting in a back corner of a lecture hall, listening to someone describe the place he had once walked through as though it were an abstract historical puzzle, and choosing, very carefully, to say only as much as he needed to say. "You corrected Damis," I said, "about the entrance orientation. You did not have to do that." "No," he agreed, "but you did." "The entrance faced the secondary sun," he said simply. "That is what it did. I could not sit there and let it be wrong." The next morning, I arrived at Lecture Hall 14 early. Rael was already there. Back corner. Same seat. He had his cup of something warm again, and he was looking at nothing in particular with the particular quality of stillness that I had, over the course of approximately 24 hours, come to understand was not absence, but the opposite of it. He was present in a way that most people in that hall would never be, carrying the weight of a history so long and so full that most of us could not have held it for an hour without our minds going quiet from the scale of it. He looked up when I came in. He nodded once. I nodded back. I sat in my usual seat. Third row, left side. Professor Dammis Cruel entered at precisely the scheduled moment. He set nothing down. He carried nothing. He walked to the front of the hall, looked at his assembled students, and then he did something I had not seen him do in 4 years of attending lectures in this building. He looked at his notes. Not the way he usually glanced at notes, as a formality, as a gesture toward the expectation that a lecturer should appear to have prepared. He looked at them the way someone looks at a document they have just realized may contain errors. Carefully, with attention. His eyes moved across the pages, with the slow deliberateness of someone checking their own work against a source they had only recently discovered was more reliable than they had previously understood. He began to lecture. He was precise, as he always was. He was authoritative, as he always was. But now, before each major claim, before each sweeping statement about what the Veranthis had built, and why and how, he paused. Just briefly. A pause that most students would not even notice. The kind of pause that sits between confidence and recalibration. And in each of those pauses, his eyes moved, almost involuntarily, to the back corner of the room. Rael did not react. He sat with his cup, his slightly imperfect posture, his unremarkable face, watching the lecture with the mild attentiveness of someone who already knew the story, but was willing to hear someone else's version of it out of a kind of patient goodwill. No one else in the hall seemed to notice the exchange, or if they did, they had the social awareness to pretend they did not. I noticed. I notice things. It is, as I have said, a professional habit. And what I noticed, sitting in my carefully strategic third-row seat on that ordinary morning above the slow-turning clouds of Dervos Prime, was this: one of the most respected minds in the known galaxy, a being who had spent 60 years of his life chasing the traces of civilizations long dead, was checking his conclusions against the recollections of a young-looking human in a slightly wrinkled uniform who had clearly cut his own hair and could not be bothered to arrive before the last possible moment. And Rael Corro, who had walked streets that no survey drone had ever reached, who had watched civilizations rise and collapse and reduce themselves to puzzle fragments that entire academic departments spent careers arguing over, who carried in his memory the face of a child on a bench that no historical record would ever know existed, was sitting in a first-year survey course, drinking something warm out of a chipped cup, and letting the lecture happen around him like weather. There is an idea that sometimes circulates in academic circles, the idea that the purpose of history is to connect us to those who came before, to make the past feel present, to collapse the distance between what was and what is. I had always thought of that as a metaphor. I looked at the back corner of the room. Rael caught my eye for a moment, brief and unplanned, and something in his expression was easy and tired and old in a way that had nothing to do with how he looked. He raised his cup slightly, the smallest possible gesture of acknowledgement, and then turned back to the lecture. And I thought, the galaxy is very large and very old, and full of things we do not know. And sometimes, if you are paying attention, you find yourself sitting in a room with one of those things, and it is drinking something warm and waiting for someone to finally get the history right. That is, I think, the closest I have ever come to understanding what it means to be human. Not the biology, not the history, not even the impossible accumulated weight of thousands of years lived in the gaps between moments that the rest of us call ancient. Just the stubbornness, the quiet, unreasonable insistence that the entrance face the secondary sun, and that this matters, and that a child on a bench in a street that no longer exists was real, and that being the only one who remembers her is not a reason to stop. The lecture continued. Outside, Dervos Prime turned slowly, in its own time, indifferent and enormous, wearing its bruise-colored clouds like a very old coat. And in the back, corner of Lecture Hall 14, the galaxy's oldest student finished his drink and listened and remembered.